this episode of Scholar Talks, the guiding question is, how did the economic, political, and foreign policy views of Henry Wallace fit into the idea of the American century? So Benn Steil is a senior fellow and director of international economics at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He's the lead writer of the Council's Geographics Economics blog and the creator of 9 web-based interactives on tracking several international economic issues. He also writes a monthly column for Barron's, and he's the author of several prize-winning books, including the definitive The Marshall Plan, Dawn of the Cold War, secondly, The Battle of Bretton Woods, John Maynard Keynes, Harry Dexter White, and the Making of a New World Order, and of course today's topic, his latest book that just came out, The World That Wasn't, Henry Wallace and the Fate of the American Century. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I am pleased to bring you another episode in the America 250 series. Ben, I want to thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
You know, I love this book on Wallace. I thought I knew Henry Wallace, Vice President, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Agriculture under FDR and Truman. Ran for president in 1948, but I did not know Henry Wallace. So I'm really eager to talk with you and to start learning about this very, very compelling figure. I wish we had a few hours to talk about him.
He is a fascinating figure, and as you say, most people really don't know very much about him, or to the extent that they do, they think they know about him, but he's actually a far more fascinating person than any of his most devoted fans generally realize.
Great. Well, I'm eager to jump in, so why don't we? So, can you provide us with just a brief sketch of Henry Wallace's political economic philosophy from his earlier life prior to becoming vice president?
Okay, so go back to the 1920s. Wallace was editor of a prominent farm journal that was founded by his grandfather called Wallace's Farmer. And through a combination of that sort of public outreach and the work he was doing on agricultural genetics, he was hybridizing corn. The corn we eat today is derived from his experiments designed to produce superior strains of corn. During that period, his economic and political philosophy began congealing, as it were. In the mid-1920s, he could be described as being primarily an economic isolationist. He was fundamentally driven by what he thought was best for the Farm Belt. And in the 1920s, he felt it was best for the Farm Belt if the United States became economically self-sufficient and detached from Europe, which he considered to be a moral quagmire. Wallace was, as you know, a very religious man in somewhat eccentric ways at times, but he always felt a moral compulsion to take one political position rather than another. But all that changed quite interestingly after passage of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930, which are very much in the news today, as you know. At that point, Wallace became convinced that policy in the United States was driven fundamentally by the perceived need to protect manufacturing, which was, in his view, fatally harming agriculture. So at that point, he becomes an internationalist. And he imbues his internationalism with a sort of moral basis. That is, that he wants to integrate the world, that he believes, as Secretary of State Cordell Hull believed, that free trade gave rise to peaceable interaction among nations. So fast forward to 1933, FDR is now president. Wallace is named Agriculture Secretary. He served in that role for 2 terms. And for the most part, during that period, his internationalism develops. And actually, that's what enamors him to FDR. Having said that, quite interestingly, he is very anti-Soviet in 1933. He actually argues vociferously with FDR that the United States should not grant diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union. And the reason, as you know, having read the book, is that during that period he had fallen under the sway of a white Russian anti-Bolshevik artist mystic named Nicholas Roerich.
This is
And
fascinating.
so, I mean, without going too deeply into that story, it is one of the most fascinating episodes in the book. In 1934 to 35, he sends Roerich off on what's allegedly a seed foraging expedition in Central Asia, which is a cover for Roerich to try to create a new theocratic state in Central Asia that will take territory from Russian Siberia, from Chinese Manchuria, which is under Japanese occupation at the time, and Mongolia. So this is one of the most dangerous places in the world. And Wallace is trying to aid Roerich in completely upsetting it politically, when a series of damning articles come out about what Roerich is up to or might be up to. Wallace disowns it entirely, and then his views on the Soviet Union begin evolving in a much more positive direction.
Right. Well, and that leads me to my next question, although I wish we could talk about that all day. So as vice president, how does Wallace involve himself in wartime planning and foreign policy, including what I don't think we can avoid calling a pretty outrageous trip to the Soviet Union and then on to China?
Yeah. So Wallace was pretty unusual for a vice president at that time, in that he did have significant managerial administrative responsibility. FDR put him in charge of one of his many, many, many acronyms. He was inventing them all the time. This one went under several guises, but ultimately it became known as the Bureau of Economic Warfare. So Wallace was head of this bureau from 1941 until FDR abolished it in 1943. And the reason is that throughout this period, when Wallace was responsible for procurement abroad, wartime procurement abroad, he was competing against others in the government, in particular Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, and Jesse Jones, the very powerful conservative Commerce Secretary. He was competing with them to set policy on procurement. And Wallace was in constant public conflict with Jesse Jones. FDR generally liked these sort of conflicts because he thought the competition brought out the best in people. Having delved into that period, I can't really say that it helped the war effort. But as I said, in July of 1943, FDR gets fed up with the squabbling, abolishes BEW, and that was sort of the pinnacle of Wallace's official participation in foreign policy. He tries to get back into that area, as you know, but never quite succeeds. So in March of 1944, Wallace goes to FDR and says he wants to visit Russia. Of course, he wants to meet Stalin. FDR, who had a few months earlier asked Wallace to take a trip to China on a very narrow mission to assure Chiang Kai-shek that the United States was indeed deeply interested in China's welfare, despite the fact that it wasn't the main theater of fighting. And he wanted Chiang Kai-shek to stop fighting against the Chinese communists and start directing his forces against the Japanese. So he wanted Wallace to deliver that message. So FDR told Wallace, absolutely no, you're not going to Moscow. But then FDR thought twice about it. And he was well aware that the leaders of the DNC, Democratic National Committee, wanted Wallace off the ticket in 44 because they could see that Roosevelt was deteriorating. And they knew whoever was vice president was going to become president, and they didn't want this pro-Soviet mystic becoming president. FDR had accepted this argument, but had not yet communicated anything to Wallace. He thought sending him to Siberia might be a way to ease him off the ticket. So FDR helpfully suggested that Wallace could go through Siberia on his way to China. And he actually spent 4 weeks traipsing through what was the Gulag Archipelago. Really quite remarkable. And the Soviets, as you know from the chapter, spent enormous amounts of money and time constructing what was in effect a Potemkin continent for Wallace. Inventing fake shops that were, of course, full of goods, convincing him that all the phenomenal local theater performances he was seeing were put on by native Asian talent, Soviet Asian talent, when in fact these were general political prisoners brought in from Moscow. Wallace falls for it. And eventually writes a travelogue called Soviet Asia Mission, which was mostly ghost written from his notes by an NKVD American journalist source named Andrew Steiger. And as you can imagine, in Wallace's later political career, he had to disown this book, and of course blamed it mostly on Steiger. Wallace was very good at blaming his political problems on others. He then goes off to China on his China mission. I thought that would be a short and uninteresting chapter because he really didn't achieve much of official notice. But I did discover from the Soviet archival material that the Soviets had been intensively spying on him while he was in Chongqing, wartime capital in China. And they discovered that Wallace, apparently away from his State Department minder, he had a minder there who was supposed to make sure he never spoke to Chiang Kai-shek alone. Wallace, of his own initiative, prodded Chiang Kai-shek to make enormous commercial and territorial concessions to the Soviets in the post-war era. The Soviets got very excited about this and assumed wrongly that Wallace was speaking for FDR. And to make a long story, in fact, fascinating long story, but a long story very short, the Soviets began taking a much more hardline position with Roosevelt on the price that they would demand for invading Manchuria after the European War had succeeded. And that was based entirely on Wallace's freelance diplomacy. You can make an argument that Wallace actually, without intending to do this, aided the CCP takeover of China in the Civil War. But because of the impetus he gave to the Soviets for occupying Manchuria for a much more extensive period than they were supposed to, and eventually handing much of that territory over to the Chinese communists.
Right. Well, I reluctantly go on to the next question because there's so much to dig around in that. So how does Wallace react to being dumped as VP, which you sort of mentioned in 1944 for FDR's fourth term? And I don't normally do this, but I want to ask you a sort of a counterfactual, which I think you addressed in your introduction, that, what if he would have become president?
Yeah. So as you know, FDR never quite came out and told Wallace, "You're gone." He gave him enormous hints. And sent emissaries to tell him, "Look, it's over. the boss wants you gone. But he refused to accept that. He insisted that he would only step off the ticket willingly if FDR looked him in the face and told him he had to do that. FDR wound up in classic FDR style, endorsing 4 separate candidates in 4 separate ways. But the way he endorsed Wallace, it was pretty clear that he expected him to be pushed off the ticket. He sent a letter to the chairman of the convention, Democratic National Convention, saying that he liked Henry Wallace. If he were a delegate, he'd vote for Henry Wallace. But of course, he was not a delegate. And who am I, FDR, to dictate to the convention? Whereas in 1940, he insisted, despite the convention overwhelmingly being against Wallace, that he, FDR, would not run for president again unless he got his choice as vice president. So there was a wild open convention in July of 44, in which Harry Truman beats out Henry Wallace only on the second ballot. Wallace is naturally pretty angry at this point, mostly at the DNC leaders. He only comes to realize later that, FDR had been part of this conspiracy. But FDR is a wily guy. He knows he can't afford to have Wallace outside the tent pissing in. He needs him inside the tent. So immediately sends him a telegram inviting him to the White House, where FDR says you can have any cabinet position you want, except Secretary of State, because Cordell Hull is, quote unquote, such an old dear. FDR can't possibly tell the old dear he's got to step down. It turns out that Hull does step down of his own volition because he's quite ill, and then FDR still doesn't offer it to Wallace. He gives it to Tinius. But FDR manipulates Wallace into accepting Secretary of Commerce, because that was the position controlled by his old arch nemesis, Jesse Jones. FDR understands that in that position he'll be able to control Wallace. It's not a position that has enormous power. Fast forward to April of 1945, FDR dies. Wallace does not become president, of course, because he's not vice president anymore. Harry Truman becomes president. And you might say at that point, well, the rest is history. But it could have been a very, very, very different history, because Truman keeps Wallace on as Secretary of Commerce, remarkably for a year and a half, because Truman reasons he also needs Wallace to protect his left flank. But Wallace spends much of that time not helping out in any way to deal with problems related to American commerce and labor relations. He, in fact, inflames all those problems, mostly, as you know, under the instigation of his advisors, most of whom are Soviet agents or hidden CPUSA members. But Wallace spends most of that time attacking Truman's foreign policy. He doesn't attack Truman personally, but indirectly attacks Jimmy Burns, Secretary of State, argues that the United States is moving in an imperialist direction internationally and moving in a fascist direction at home, in which the military, he argues, is basically taking over the country. So what kind of policies does Wallace support? Policies of intimate post-war collaboration with the Soviet Union. He opposes the Truman Doctrine. He opposes the policy of containment. He opposes the Marshall Plan, or at least he does when Stalin comes out against it. He opposes the creation of West Germany. He opposes the creation of NATO. So as you can imagine, we would have had a very different suite of policies had Henry Wallace been president. Now, I argue in the book, and I think Wallace himself would accept this based on his later reflections. As you know, he eventually recants and says that he was mistaken in his views of Stalin and the Soviet Union. But this Oliver Stone argument that there would have been no Cold War if Henry Wallace had become president is clearly wrong. Because the Soviets were absolutely determined not only to expand their borders, but to expand their security buffers in Central and Eastern Europe and in Asia. Wallace acknowledges that he would have lost the election in 48 and policy would have changed dramatically. But if Wallace had been president, we would have been fighting the Cold War at a major disadvantage by that point. I think you can make a strong argument that the Soviets would have perhaps stayed in Manchuria. That's very possible. They would have controlled the whole Korean peninsula. They would likely have controlled the Turkish Straits. Possibly they would have intervened much more heavily on behalf of the Greek communists in the Greek Civil War. And of course, the main battle in the early Cold War was for Germany. And there's a lot of evidence that the Soviets would have succeeded in taking over the entirety of the country if Wallace had been president, because, again, he opposed all U.S. policies aimed at keeping Western Germany firmly in the democratic capitalist camp.
Right. So
there's a lot there.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, and it's a little shocking at times, but yeah. So what was his economic vision then as Secretary of Commerce in terms of like national planning or other policies as a progressive? And why does Truman ask for his resignation? Basically.
So I mean, his formal responsibilities are naturally as Commerce secretaries today to pursue the interests of U.S. commercial enterprises broadly, domestically and internationally. He doesn't do that. He involves himself initially heavily in labor relations in a very counterproductive way. As you know, the U.S. economy had operated under tight price and wage controls during the war. Those are relaxed in the immediate post-war period. Naturally, there's going to be some labor strife because the unions, quite rightly, want wages to come up. But Wallace supported rather extreme positions, again, endorsed by his advisors who actually wanted to create a national labor crisis in the United States. And they wanted the government to take over mines and railroads and so on. So Wallace came out, for example, for 25% across the board wage rises, with price rises being outlawed by the government. Eventually, Truman becomes utterly infuriated by Wallace's unwillingness to help tamp down this crisis, takes control of it himself, and does quite a good job ending the strikes and reviving the U.S. economy. I don't think he gets quite enough credit for how well he handled a very difficult position. But as I said, Wallace spent much of his time attacking Truman's foreign policy, arguing that it was moving in a militaristic, imperialistic, fascistic direction, and particularly attacking U.S. atomic policy. The United States was trying to, through the new United Nations, establish an atomic regulation regime in which the Soviets would allow inspection so he could ensure that they were not developing a weapon, in return for which the United States would be effectively put its nuclear arsenal under UN control and then dismantle it. So it was a quite sophisticated phased program. Wallace entirely mischaracterized U.S. policy, taking it directly, as I found, from Pravda. again, under the influence of his advisors who were working for the Soviet Union. Truman put up with this for an extremely long period, as I said, a year and a half. Wallace was in that position until finally, in September of 1946, Secretary of State Jimmy Burns threatens to resign. Bernard Baruch, who's the U.S. representative on the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, is utterly infuriated at how Wallace is undermining him, and Truman finally decides enough is enough. Tells Wallace he has to go.
Right. And he runs for president in 1948 and has something you've alluded to several times, some pretty extensive pro-Soviet views on foreign policy, seems to blame the United States for the Cold War, kind of excuses Soviet actions. I assume I'm on the right path here from what you've said already. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit? Or
so, I mean, yes, you've described it accurately. He takes very pro-Soviet positions. Anything that Stalin opposes, like the Marshall Plan, Wallace opposes. Certainly the most startling thing I discovered about the 48 campaign when Wallace runs as a progressive party candidate for president is that in March, April, and early May, he actually colludes with Stalin to undermine American foreign policy. He approaches the Soviet UN ambassador, Andrei Gromyko, whom he knew personally, but he approaches him indirectly because he doesn't want this being discovered. Through the Czech UN ambassador, Vladimir Hudek, he delivers documents to him. Secret meetings are arranged between the two. Wallace, to Gromyko's complete shock, says that he wants to reach a complete agreement with Stalin sometime in the coming 2 months to clear up all the problems between them. Gromyko, like a good Soviet diplomat who has no wiggle room in terms of negotiating agreements, just said, "What do you want?" Because he's got to pass this information on to Moscow. And Wallace says again and again, "I don't want anything." Okay, the Generalissimo Stalin can indicate what these issues will be. And so Wallace makes his most important election speech in May of 1948 at Madison Square Garden in front of 20,000 people. And I have Stalin's handwritten edits on Wallace's draft for that speech. And we know that Stalin's edits actually went into the speech because we can see how the speech changed after these communications. The State Department naturally suspected that Wallace was colluding with Moscow, but didn't have the evidence that I have today. Putting FBI agents into the copy shop where Wallace had printed up his speech before the rally. They were able to determine that Wallace knew certain things that he could not have known had he not been in contact with the Kremlin at the time he was. But fascinatingly, the Truman administration decides not to do anything about it. This is like the clearest case of a violation of the Logan Act, the 1799 Logan Act in American history. But they do nothing. And why? Because it's not helping Wallace. He's plummeting in the polls. The closer he gets to the Soviets, the more he plummets in the polls. So the Truman administration decides to let him hang himself. He's actually helping Harry Truman against Thomas Dewey, which was completely the Republican candidate. Unexpected, because he's making Truman look tougher than the public perceives him to be. By this point, the public is to the right of Truman on containment policy. So he actually helped. And as you know, Wallace did very poorly in the election. He started out as the third party candidate. He ended as the fourth party candidate, coming in with barely over 1 million votes behind Dixiecrat segregationist Strom Thurmond. So he got no electoral votes whatsoever. In his own home state of Iowa, he got barely 1% of the vote. So, by this time in his career, he's just persona non grata in the Farm Belt, which is quite remarkable story for someone who started his career as an agricultural expert.
Right. So, final question is: how did the economic, political, and foreign policy views of Henry Wallace fit, or maybe in light of our discussion, not fit, into the idea of the American century?
Well, this phrase, the American century, was coined by publishing magnate Henry Luce in a famous Life magazine article in February of 1941 called The American Century, in which Luce argued that it was really an obligation of the United States to begin being, this was before the U.S. was in the war, but Luce said, hey, for all intents and purposes, we're in it now, we're going to be in it, we need to define it. What are we fighting for? And Luce argued, basically, we're fighting for democracy, we're fighting for freedom, we're fighting for free trade. Those are the things we stand for. Those are the values that we need to spread through the world, not militaristically, but through the establishment of new institutions, like the United Nations, that would become FDR's pet project. And Wallace in 1942 sets himself up as the anti-Luce. He, in a speech that became known as the Common Man speech, he coins the phrase the century of the common man. He characterizes Luce as being effectively an imperialist. And advocating a form of American imperialism after the war, whereas he, Henry Wallace, is advocating for international cooperation based on the needs of the common man around the world. And it's at this point that Wallace begins developing into the progressive icon that he's widely known as today.
Well, Ben, I want to thank you very much for joining us. Congratulations on the new book, and thanks for coming to talk about this really compelling figure and very interesting topic.
Thanks for having me, Tony. I enjoyed it.
Great, thanks. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out the other interviews in our America 250 series on our channel and press subscribe.